Hi, I'm Peter Reinhardt, and welcome to the Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread. I'm coming to you from the Hance Auditorium in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we've held the last 4 bread symposiums, and as you can see, there's nobody here but me. And this is where we usually have it. The seats are all empty because this year, thanks to you, the symposium will be presented online, virtually, in our new presentation hall, which is where I will join you in just a minute. Thank you, and thanks for being part of our new virtual Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread, presented by Puratos. Welcome again. Throughout the entire symposium, I'll be thanking our generous sponsors over and over again, and ask that you do as well by visiting their booths and pavilions in the exhibitor hall. There you will see lots of bonus content, and you can also make appointments to meet with the folks from these companies that serve our baking community so well. Our presenting sponsor is Puratos, who has partnered with us from the very beginning for all of our symposiums, and it is their support that helped us get this one-of-a-kind gathering of thought leaders off the ground. Please also visit our fabulous flour and milling sponsors, Ardent Mills, Lindley Mills, and Central Milling. Thank you also to our equipment sponsors, the WP Bakery Group and Allied Bakery and Food Service Equipment. And thank you also to our specialty food product companies, Probiotine, Fire Within, Big Green Egg, and Mock Mill. Please check out all of their booths to learn about their wonderful and unique products. And also thanks to our media sponsors, Cook's Country, The Local Palate, the James Beard Foundation, and the Bread Bakers Guild of America. You'll be hearing more about all of them throughout the entire series of presentations. So again, thank you to all our sponsors. At the end of today's presentation, you will also see our credit scroll thanking all of the people behind the scenes who made this event possible, including our production and technical partner, Ganoid Communications, our creative team at Gumbo Marketing, and the many folks at Johnson & Wales University, our hosts for this, our 4th annual gathering. So stick around if you will. But now it's time to get things rolling with today's presentation, so let's go live. And once again, welcome to the Johnson & Wales International Symposium on Bread, presented by Puratos. And welcome. We are live. I'm live. I'm coming to you again from my office here in Charlotte, North Carolina. You can see that I'm still getting set up. I got some new glasses today. I just had, believe it or not, my 2nd cataract surgery yesterday. So now I'm seeing for the first time through regular glass instead of my high volume prescription glasses. I'm still getting used to all that. The screen's a little wobbly, but I'm here. But I'm really excited about what we're going to be doing today with Edan Leshnick, baker at Bread's Bakery in New York City. We're going to meet him in just a second, and I see him as he's already joined us. But before we do, a couple of quick announcements. And I've seen already some people on the chat side are pretty excited. OMG, this demo is going to be awesome. I agree. And so somebody's familiar with your babka, and it's Ann. And Ann says it's the best babka ever. So we're looking to that.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, right. And I want to remind you that on Monday, come on back Monday, we've got a presentation by Stephen Bloom, who is from Allied Baking Equipment Company. He's going to present, I gave you the wrong title on Monday when I introduced this, but his is going to be called Thermal Oil Technology, Back to the Future of Baking. So essentially, he's going to be covering the past, present, and future of thermal oil technology and its implications for the baking industry. And Stephen really is, the expert on, and perhaps the single most important guy in bringing thermal oil baking technology to the United States. And he's going to fill us in not only on what it is, but where it's going. So we really want to always, on these technology track presentations, be looking into the future and its implications on the future of baking. So please come back for that. And next Wednesday, in our Wednesday demonstration series, Bake Like a Pro, we have Daisy Chow, who's going to be demonstrating how she makes a destination-worthy croissant using high extraction flour. And we've talked about this over the last few weeks. So those of you who've been here before know what that's about. If you want more information, just go to the homepage, read the summaries of everybody's presentations, and beyond that, the weeks to come. I won't pitch all the other ones because you can see them for yourself. And I'm anxious to get into Edan's presentation. But a final announcement is that if you have not already been to the sponsor booth and signed the guest books, if you sign at least 3 guest books in the sponsor pavilions, you become eligible for our Wheel of Fortune prize, which is, again, I lost my knife. I had it here. Here it is. This beautiful Henkel's bread knife. I call it a bread sword that will go to the person whose name comes up. But in order to be eligible to win, you have to sign up at least in 3 booths. And then we'll repeat this every month. We'll do another kind of spinning wheel prize, and we'll up the ante each month and have you go to more booths. And this is just also to encourage you to visit and get the great content that's provided in those booths. Enough promotion, time for today's presentation. So I'd like to welcome and introduce Edan Leshnick. Where are you coming from, Edan? Why don't you tell us about yourself? And I'm going to pretty much mute my camera, turn it over to you, and let you just take it from here. And I might jump in from time to time with questions that our viewers send to me. So folks, use your Q&A or use your chat. I'll make note of your questions and work them in as Edan is giving his demonstration. Edan, you're on.
Thank you very much, Peter. You can hear me well, right? I just want to make sure that sounds good.
I can hear you.
Perfect. So we're here at Union Square at Bread's Bakery here in New York. And we're about to produce or show you how to make some of our signature Nutella Babka or Chocolate Babka. And I say Nutella and chocolate because it's a very, we call it a very unwell kept secret because we've told everybody that we use Nutella. And part of it, as I'll explain throughout the video, is why we chose to do that instead of a ganache or instead of different flavor profiles that we could have chosen with or could have gone with. But in general, we're about to make one of our signature dishes. So chocolate babka is a traditional, as most of you probably know by now, it's been gaining a lot of popularity. And it's a traditional Eastern European dish that has originally been made many, many years ago. With different techniques and not the same techniques that we use here at Bread's Bakery. But by all means, they have been used for many, many years and have actually accomplished their goal of introducing babka to the world. And then for us, we kind of took it to a whole new level in terms of the process and the techniques that we're using in terms of laminating the dough, and in terms of how we're processing the entire production and streamlining that into a large scale operation. As you can see behind me, there's a lot of tables and a lot of operation happening, and it's 24/7. So even during the pandemic that sadly we've all experienced, we've been on the entire time making babka. Many other products, but babka just as well. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I come originally from Israel, so I'm familiar with what babka is. We call it a different product in Israel. We call it a kranz cake, which is traditionally German crown. But here in America, I've reintroduced myself to the word babka, which basically has many meanings. I think it means grandma in Serbian, maybe, or in Russian. So that's where it comes from. But the whole entire process, we're going to start off right now. And Peter, if you have any questions as we go along, I'll be happy to answer and kind of explain why we chose to do what we did.
Okay. So Edan, let me jump in and let the viewers know that you're seeing Edan on 2 cameras right now. We've got 2 cameras. One of them is going to be moving around. Right now, it's all the same view, but one of them will be moving around to get better angles as we go. So don't worry if you're seeing him twice. It's intentional. And one of the cameras is muted, so we're getting all the sound through the one that's straight shot. And later on, we'll get some angled shots. So that's just to bring everybody, because that question's come up on the chat already.
Is why am I showing up twice?
Yeah, right. How can you be in
I'm
two
everywhere.
places at once? Yes.
That's what my guys always say. Okay, so we're gonna start off with some of our kind of the basics and how we're gonna get, from a dough into a laminated dough into a actual babka at the end of the day. So I think we're also showing some of our babka of the finished product. But in general, we always start from mixing the dough and fermenting it and leaving it to ferment enough time to develop flavors, and also to make it a lot more easy for us to actually laminate. And if you're not familiar with the term laminating or folds or whatever, we're going to show you kind of how we do it here at Breads. And of course, this whole process lends itself to many other, it's a platform to use many other products. So whether it's a croissant that's a laminated product or a puff pastry, all of these are falling within the category of a laminated product. Whereas babka takes its own kind of like seat amongst those laminated items. And that's what we're going to show. So let's start off with, I have Chris here who's going to help me out today. We're going to start off by mentioning the fact that we have mixed the dough overnight and left it to ferment overnight for at least 12 hours. Now, when we say overnight, some people, don't sleep much, and then that's 4 hours. Some people sleep a lot more, so that's 12 hours. A lot of these timeframes depend on the variables in our recipe. Many different activities, enzymatical activities are happening during that time. So 12 hours is ideal for our process. So after 12 hours, our dough is going to end up, I'm going to have Chris bring that over right now.
While he's bringing it over, is that 12 hours at room temperature or in cold temperatures?
That's 12 hours at cold temperature, at 4 degrees Celsius. I apologize ahead of time if I use Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. I do come from Israel, and it's much easier for me, and it's the better way to go. But for the Americans out there, Fahrenheit.
For Americans,
we'll
it's a little bit below 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
Exactly. Yeah. So our dough here. I wish, like maybe next time, Peter, on the symposium, we could find a way to transfer aromas and smells. But
We're working on
it. I don't know. Maybe Gurmit can work on that as well.
We are.
But what we have here is basically a dough that's very chilled. It's at 4 degrees Celsius as well. So it's important. A lot of times I tell my guys also when we're laminating, it's important for the dough to be chilled. Obviously, it depends on the process. So if we're gonna, what we're calling a lock-in, we're gonna place a block of butter in here and leave it until we get to sheet it. If this is gonna be left for too long, what's gonna end up happening is the saturated fat in the butters are gonna start to crystallize, and it's gonna start to break as we're trying to sheet. And we wanna avoid that. So the goal here is to get both the temperature of the butter, the temperature of the dough, and their consistencies to match. So it sounds very technical, but in reality, what we end up having is, as you can see right over here, is this beautiful block of butter. And it magically is just the right size for this dough. So that's the power of TV. What we have here, as you can see, is I'm kind of like, I'm going to show you the texture of it. It's very, very pliable. And this is super important for a good quality lamination. And basically, once we laminate, I'm going to also cut the dough to show you what that lamination looks like. But basically, if you see, my dough is nice and pliable, my butter is nice and pliable, and both are cold, both at around 4 degrees. So a little over, I think it's like 42 degrees Fahrenheit, if I'm not mistaken, but something like that.
So the butter's cold enough to be really firm. It's not super pliable at this stage.
Yeah, well, it's fairly pliable, but a lot of what makes a lamination successful is using the right kind of butter as well. So if we're gonna actually go through the process of laminating, which is it's a long process, and obviously, we take a lot of pride in our laminating. If you're gonna actually do this, you want to use a good quality butter. And when I say good quality, I've had people say, "Oh, so I'm going to look for an 84% fat butter as opposed to an 82." It doesn't necessarily mean that the 84% will react better than an 82% fat content. There's a lot to do with the balance of the saturated and unsaturated fats in there that can create that pliability and that plasticity. and the way the fat crystallizes. So every maker has their own secrets of how they're producing butter. And this is in itself, in my opinion, deserves a lot of credit. You know, like this butter has been processed in a very, very quality fashion. And you can see it as we're going to work on it right now.
Well, I'm going to have to ask a question here, Edan, and if these are proprietary, then feel free not to tell us. But if you can, some of the questions are already coming in. Is there anything you can share about either the type or the brand of the butter, and what percentage of butter fat it is holding?
Yeah, so this technically is an 82%,
Okay.
and that's why it's important for me to stress out the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the amount or the fat content. Yes, you're looking for at least an 82 to an 84%. 85 and 86, there are butters out there that have that amount of fat content, but I would say that it would be overkill to a certain degree to use those kind of butters.
Unsalted butter, correct?
Unsalted butter. Now you could use salted butter for other processes, like for example, if you're familiar with Queen Amman, traditionally Queen Amman was used as a salted butter into a baguette dough, a leftover baguette dough, and laminated. Now these days we're using croissant dough, and we could use salted butter. You can also add or sprinkle in or make our butter block with salt. In this case, we're not interested in those kind of flavors. We're adding the salt into our dough, and we have enough salt content in both our filling. So it should be enough for us. Now, if you want to use a salted butter, you have to remember that you have to balance it out and make sure that your dough, I wouldn't advise taking down the salt too much in the dough, obviously. But in your fillings, you have to balance that out and remember that, okay, I'm using a salted butter. I have to track back a little bit on that salt in the filling or in the preparation itself.
And that one other question while you're doing this is also that people are asking, will you be able to provide some kind of a formula or recipe that they can follow if they want to try to make this at home? Or is that still proprietary?
Yeah. Well, we have our home version recipe at home, which makes a lot more sense in terms of what I'm showing you right now. This is a big amount of dough, and in terms of the process, this makes more sense to use on a commercial sheeter, which we're going to use as well. But if you're going to make this at home, you have to change, and this is a recipe that we published online, you'd have to change the ratio of your flours a little bit and the balance of the dough in terms of hydration, just to make sure that you're able to actually, it's a workout to actually laminate at home. And I've tried this a few times, and I always get frustrated because the layers never come out the same as in the bakery. But summertime in New York, it's super humid here. If you're going to try this at home, you give me your resume and I'll hire you.
Well, so later on, we'll post whatever the recipe that you have published. If you could have someone, maybe Danielle could send that to us. We'll post it in the archive section where we're collecting all the recipes and make that available to all the followers.
Sure, sounds perfect. Okay, so having said all those, just kind of as a prerequisite, we're going to start working this butter into the dough and folding this or locking in what we call this butter into the dough. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to grab just a standard rolling pin. Most people have these at home. And as I'm feeling this, I feel that the butter is slightly cold. I want to make it slightly more malleable. So I'm just going to very lightly tap it. What this does is it basically starts to temp our butter. Just like that. And then I'm going to go over it with the rolling pin just to make sure that it's locked on. So that's why we call this process the locking process, is because now our butter is locked in to the top of the dough. All right.
And we're switching over to the other, it looks like, okay, now we have both cameras again, but we're close up on one of them. That's okay. We're close up on one of them. I think that's what people want to see.
Yeah. Okay. So at this point, I have my butter that's locked onto the top of the dough. And now this is something interesting because a lot of people would opt to just fold this right over to the butter. I don't like that method just because, and I'll explain why. I'm going to use my rolling pin one more time here to just kind of flatten out these edges. And now what I'm showing you here is actually a process that we do at the bakery. So even though we're using commercial sheeters and everything like that, we're still this is all being processed by hand. So every single dough, and we make a lot of babka here, every single dough is being processed this way. So as you can see, I created these like big flaps here on the side. And if Sarah can show also this part, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a paring knife and I'm just gonna cut right along the edge of this butter. So just like that. And what this does is, now that I flip this part right over and I want to envelop this butter block into the dough, I'm now exposing every single side of the entire block. So I have 4 sides that are all exposed with dough, butter, dough, dough, butter, dough on every single side. What this is going to do is going to create a much cleaner laminating process, and our layers are going to be even way cleaner, way more defined, so that with every bite that you take off of this babka, you're going to feel an even amount of the laminating process, so an even amount of dough, butter, dough. So
you buy those butter blocks already pre-made, Edan?
We actually make them here. So we buy butter and cut them into the different weights that we need. And we actually work them on the sheeter, folding them a few times on their own, just the butter itself, which already gives you an idea as to how pliable this butter is and how workable it is, and makes sense for our production. But we still give it a series of maybe like 2 or 3 folds just to get even more pliable and to regulate the temperature even better. So at this point, we are good to go. So as you can see, I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to show you that in every side, we have a good amount of dough, butter, dough, and they're all exposed. This is what exposing these layers is what's going to give us at the end result a much better, cleaner flavor of everything all together. So a much well-balanced dough. Now we're going to move on to the sheeting process. So we're actually going to give this now the series of folds the same way as what we do here every day at the bakery. So Chris, if you want to get started on the sheeter. So as you can see, Chris is going to start sheeting out this dough in a process and giving it a series of folds that are going to create all these layers. Now, there are many different types of folds. I'm going to stand here so you can see me on both cameras. There are many different types of folds that we use, for many different purposes. Generally speaking, I don't want to get too technical, but generally speaking, the more folds you're going to try to give a certain dough, the higher percentage of butter you need, or butter to dough ratio in your laminating. So if we're only going to give this dough, for example, a single fold or one book fold, we're only going to need a certain amount of butter to meet that criteria. But if we're going to use it for example, for a puff pastry, now puff pastry is going to get many more folds, and the gluten network is going to have to work even more in order to accommodate all that. We want to raise our ratio of butter to dough by, it could be 5 to 10%, whatever works, depending on the folds. But that will make much more sense at the end result. It's just going to make a much more malleable dough, much easier to work with dough than having less butter in it. So more butter is usually the answer.
What's the ratio in this particular instance?
So this one, we're using 25%.
25% butter to dough.
Correct.
Okay.
So as you can see also, as the sheeting is going on, what Chris is doing is he's using a paring knife to also expose the sides of those layers. And that creates a much more relaxed dough. Because remember that this sheeter is so powerful, if we were to do this by hand, we would feel the strength of this dough. But because he's trimming off the edges and also making sure that the sides of the dough are being exposed as he's going along, it's relaxing the dough even more and allowing that butter, all those layers, to go into their place basically without creating too much tension on the dough.
I keep getting the question, did you happen to mention what brand of butter you are using?
No, I haven't mentioned what brand, but I'll tell you the top 3 brands that I prefer to use here. One of them would be Elevire, which Elevire is a French butter. The other one would be a President, which is, I believe, also French. And then our last one would be Isigny, which is made in Calvados, so Normandy, which is very, very good. There are American butters that do a great job as well, American companies, but we haven't been able to find the right consistency yet with solely using one kind or another. There's so many variables, and what I really enjoy in terms of finding a really good quality butter is that sometimes you can hit that spot. You can get like amazing butter, and it works for like a few months, and then suddenly, you see some changes, not necessarily for the worse, but you see some changes that really lets you know that this is a living product that comes from a living being, and has so much to do with the diet and the weather and the climate, that it's just an amazing thing. So every once in a while, we kind of go through this process of like, okay, let's try this butter, and then let's try that butter. And flavor profile obviously has huge part here. I mean, we're talking about lactic acids here that are very interesting for us. So this is what we have at the end. As you can see, I'm going to expose this to show these layers. Let me grab a turning. Got this. Okay, so I'm kind of going to cut right across the dough here, and I'm going to show you what we end up getting. This is really, really one of those things that always kind of capture the eye. So if you can see that.
We can see a lot of layers.
A lot of layers. So this is what's going to create that really, really interesting texture. A lot of people, they see all that butter that goes into the dough, but and they think that it's going to be a very dense, heavy product. But in reality, laminating actually gives you a much lighter texture, because of the layers opening up like that. You're not getting a dense texture at all. You're actually getting a much lighter. Of course, you have to pair it with the right balance of how many folds you're going to give it, what type of folds you're going to give it as well. Generally speaking, the less folds, the thicker the layers. So the more folds, for example, in puff pastry, you might sometimes not even see those layers. But here with the babka, for me, this is just the right balance of layering and to actually feel this texturally.
So if you could review those layers, you did looked like basically a letter fold or a threefold to the first time. How many cycles of that did you do? Did you do another threefold?
So we did that twice. We did two of those folds, and that's all it takes really for us. For me, I like to keep that process very, very gentle on the gluten as well. Keep in mind that if we're going to go for a third fold, sometimes you have to let the dough rest in between those folds. For our purposes, it's never going to be the right way to work, because we have to go at a quicker pace, but also to make sure that the quality is maintained. So in this case,
if we do the math, and you have dough, fat, dough, that's 3 layers. Right. Then you do a threefold, so that's 9. 3 times 3. Exactly. Then 9 times 3 is 27. So we've got 27 layers of dough, butter, dough.
Correct.
All right, good.
Correct. Okay, so this at this point, this dough is ready. What we need to do is chill it, and make sure that this is going to be ready to work with as well. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to actually produce the babka. I don't want to bore you with all the details of laminating without actually showing you the babka itself.
Right, but this is so critical. Not that many places make their babka out of laminated dough. Most places just use a rich dough and just form it into a bread. Yes. And this is a super kind of important role of how we process our doughs and what makes our babka so unique in that case. Laminated doughs produce a completely different result in terms of the end texture. So that's pretty much it. At this point, before you move on, though, there's a couple things that are hanging fire for me. What happens to all that scrap you trimmed off? That you're not throwing that out. Are you reusing it somewhere?
Yes, that is calculated into our dough, into our next batches as pâte fermentée. So obviously, in order to, actually, it's part of the formula is to also formulate. It's very interesting. I was working on the other day on formulating pâte fermentée or scraps, and when you start to break down scraps, it's kind of like you can go crazy by breaking down scraps, because every scrap dough every scrap dough has scraps from the previous mix, and every previous mix has scraps from the previous mix. Yeah. And each one has that. And if you try to actually break down, you're always going to have the micrograms, milligrams that have scraps, and you're never going to be able to have an entire 100% recipe formulated. And I can go crazy because I'm very OCD about these things.
Like compounding interest.
Yeah, exactly. It just never ends. So yeah, we use those as pâte fermentée. and basically add those in. So we ferment those for another 12 hours at 4 degrees, and then add them into our mix for the next day.
Beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. So nothing is going to be wasted. All right. So at this point, I'm going to have Chris start to sheet out our ready to use babka dough, which this one has been folded already before. And what we're going to do now is actually sheet it out into a long dough, approximately 2.5 millimeters. And now this is something very important as well, is when you're sheeting out, when you're creating your own babka, because hopefully whoever watches this video is going to be inspired to create their own take on a babka or a take on a laminated pastry. And what I want to say to that is also keep in mind that the thickness of the dough, this is something that gets overlooked a lot, is the thickness of the dough makes a huge difference at the end result. So if you're going for, just for the sake of an example, 4 millimeters of a dough, which is quite thick, and you're going to put the same ratio of filling as if you were going to, as if, you know, the same that we do here, for example, you're not going to get the same result because your ratio of filling to dough is going to change. And when you bite into it, you're going to feel way more dough, less filling. Mm-hmm. Now, some people prefer that. Some people like that fact that you have more dough to less filling. Depends on the filling also. Depends if the filling is super sweet, super tart, or whatever it is, you might want that balance. But keep in mind that sometimes what you're looking for is just that right balance between a nice thin dough with an even amount or more filling to kind of compensate for it so that you can feel more of that filling. So, you know, keep that in mind as well, because a lot of times that doesn't get enough credit. It's not always the filling. The dough here is super important.
This
is kind of my, you know, it's my philosophical take on my philosophy in general and on food making and preparation, is that, you know, a lot of people pay a lot of attention to the type of butter that we use in our croissants. But for me, when you think about it, you're using your dough comprises a whole part, a much bigger part of the butter that's being laminated into it. So respect the dough. Of course, respect the butter, but respect the dough, because this is going to contribute a lot to the flavor. All right, so as you can see, probably from the second camera, we have a very long dough here that this is going to yield 16 individual babkas. So each babka is about 450 grams, which is a substantial amount. Now we do this when we actually work on babka. This is a daily process that takes at least 2 people, usually on 2 tables simultaneously, 2 long tables just like this. And this is being produced for a good amount of time, at least 2-3 hours of the day. We're making 1,000 babkas, thousands of babkas in the holidays, every single day. So, you know, Chris and I have been working on babka for a long time. So we're kind of like, my wife is getting a little jealous right now. But Chris is going to start off by just spreading the Nutella. So we can also talk about why we chose to use Nutella in this case, or a hazelnut type paste type flavoring. Now, for me, as a child, and this is, you know, when I grew up in Israel, Nutella is very dear to my heart. And obviously, we know that Nutella, there are many, you know, different factors to how sweet Nutella is. For some people, it's too sweet. That's fine. But we're countering that with a dough that's not as sweet. And what we're doing is basically kind of trying to reminisce about the nostalgic days of, you know, yourself as a younger kid, being able to eat copious amount of Nutella without feeling guilty at all. Which, you know, I try to these days, but I'm not succeeding that well. But yeah, especially after the pandemic, I've been eating more babka.
Is that straight Nutella, or is it fortified with some additional ingredients like extra chocolate or anything like that?
This one is straight up Nutella. We are going to use chocolate chips, bittersweet chocolate chips to counter that. And yeah, so we're going to talk about the chocolate chips as well as we're going to produce this. But first off, we're kind of going to show how we're spreading this around. So Chris is usually on this side. That's why I'm like so habitual about these things. But basically what we're doing here, as you can see, sometimes no words needed to these kind of processes, but they're just
worth
really
1,000
pretty.
words. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one nice thing about that Nutella is that it stays in place. It doesn't kind of run out, right? Because you just have it at room temperature or what?
Yeah. We have to during the winter time to it kind of solidifies pretty well. So we have to warm it up before we use it. Also, another key aspect here, and you got to remember this, is that the stability of Nutella in the oven is something super important for us as well. Obviously, we could opt to use a straight up ganache of equal parts cream and chocolate, but it won't hold up in the oven. Most of the time, you get a very broken texture. Most of the time, you're using cocoa butter, which is not going to hold up to this amount of heat. So Nutella actually has enough dry extract and enough bake stability to kind of hold in there and keep the moisture in there as well, which is very important. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slice the dough lengthwise in half, so just like that. And this would go by eye, but hopefully I'm accurate, even with the jitters of the camera in front of me.
10,000 hours of practice, man.
Yeah, I've had some. And now we're using some bittersweet chocolate chips. So this is actually going to counter with that sweetness of the Nutella. And it's important to realize that these chocolate chips, we could have used many different brands, many different types of and ratios of sugar to these chocolate chips. But this is actually, it works pretty well to kind of counter a little bit of that sweetness, balance it out a little bit, and give it a little bit more depth. Kind of helps us in this process, and also gives you texturally, because these are also, their cocoa butter amount is fairly low, they won't melt in the oven. So obviously, you'll get that texture when you bite into it. So you get the texture of the chocolate chips, the texture of the Nutella, and the texture of the laminated dough all together. So 3 of those textures are going to come into play.
Like chocolate. Chocolate,
yes. Every time someone says Nutella is chocolate, I correct them. But all right, so now what we're doing is we're just rolling this up into a roulade. And as you can see from the side view here, it's basically a tight kind of roll that's going to encompass all these layers in between them of Nutella and chocolate chips and the dough. We're stretching it out just enough to kind of get the right size of pieces. Now, we've been doing this for a while, so obviously Chris and I know how much to stretch out, and you're kind of adept at it. But at home, I would say if you're trying to make this at home, if you feel the dough retracting, or if you feel the dough kind of very much, fighting back on you, either let it rest in the fridge, let it relax, or realize that this is the moment to stop and don't go any further. Okay, so we're gonna do both. We're gonna do this on both sides.
While you're doing that roll, the question came in terms of the butter. In addition to the butter you laminated in, was there any butter in the actual dough that they trompe that you made before you laminated?
Yes, there is butter in the dough itself, which allows us. First of all, it retains, in terms of the texture of this dough, it's gonna create a much better texture at the end, having some butter in the dough and some butter in the laminating. Now, if you're trying to formulate this recipe a little bit different, if you want more butter in the laminating, I would opt to lower the butter in the dough itself. But from my experience, also, if you ever look at a recipe, for example, which is similar, of a laminated brioche has a lot more butter in the détrempe and as well in the folds, and it ends up creating very, very crisp layers. Now, you might want that, but sometimes you might want to lower. If you lower the butter, you're going to get a slightly fluffier texture. So not as crisp, not as firm in terms of the end result. So it depends, again, on how you're going to bake it. There's so many factors. If you're going to bake it in a mold, for example, you're going to retain a lot of that moisture on the side, so you won't necessarily taste that. But if you're going to bake it freeform, a lot of that crispiness is going to come to play here if you're using a very high fat détrempe and a lot of butter in the laminating.
Thank you. And then another question that came through was when you were doing those folds, one person said they thought you had done a book fold and not a letter fold. Can you clarify what kind of fold you did?
Did I say book? Did I say letter fold?
I said letter fold, but were those book folds?
Yeah, we were using a book fold, or a double fold is what I like to call it. But
Okay,
a
so
book
a
fold,
double
yeah.
fold, then the number of layers goes way up. Then it goes
Yeah,
from
so we're going,
12 to 36. You got 48 layers, and not
yes,
just 27. Okay.
yes,
Thank you,
I
Mike,
apologize
for
for
teaching
the,
that.
Mike, thank you for noticing. Okay, so at this point, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these two roulades, and basically I'm just gonna slice this right down the middle with a pizza wheel, right in half. So what I'm doing right now is exposing all that roulade that we've created, as well as, if you can see on a close-up here, what ends up happening is that all of their layers here from the laminating, and then there are the individual layers of the actual roll. So we have 2, 4, 6 layers from rolling, but then all those 48 layers, as we've mentioned, of the fold itself. And sprinkled in between, we have our Nutella and our chocolate chips.
Whew, phenomenal.
Yeah. So, a lot of times, things seem very, very simple, and they are, but when you really dive into them, you understand how complex the whole system is.
Well, this is definitely not your everyday babka, and it's definitely not your grandmother's babka, because I don't know any grandmother who had a sheeter like you have.
If ever there was a grandma in Russia back then who had a sheeter, she would make a killing.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so at this point, we're gonna actually cut these into individual pieces, because obviously this is one giant roll, and it'll be very difficult for us to braid this at this point. So what I'm doing is I'm just cutting this. This is about 10.5 to 11 inches in length. And we're not gonna share the secret that we have the lines marked in the back of the table, so you'll think that we did this on our own, that they're all really even, and we're happy to do that, but we're not gonna tell you that they're marked. At this point, what we're gonna do is gonna start shaping. So as you can see, I'm just crossing it. I tend to, now this is a personal preference, it's as if, some people score baguettes slightly different, but they all kind of look the same. For us, we each braid slightly different. As you can see, Chris crosses it right in the middle, and I do it a little offset. It is whatever works for you. And I say at the end, if the end result works and the end result looks consistent, then I don't mind anyway, whatever works. What we're gonna do is basically just braid them now and just cross them. So just like this, and then just like this. As you can see, what ends up happening is that.
I wish I had our slow motion camera going so we could see that, but that was because you got it down pat. So essentially, you're both getting to the same place. But yeah, go ahead. Here we go.
Let's do the slow mo now. So
you're making a twist, and then it's continuing on the other way.
Exactly.
This dough kind of looks like Danish dough. Can this dough also be used to make Danish pastries and other kinds of products besides this?
Yeah, it could definitely be used for that. I would suggest perhaps use a slightly stronger flour here, just to get a little bit more expansion from whatever shapes you're making. But sometimes if you're going to make a laminated Danish, depends on what you're looking for. But if you want that layering to kind of come through and really show itself, I would go for a slightly stronger flour, just to compensate for it.
I see. Get more.
For us, we use a medium or a blend of different flours. But what we're doing here is we're actually trying to control the expansion in the mold as they go into the mold or as they bake. If you're going to use a very, very strong dough, or say even a laminated brioche, which is a slightly stronger dough, you might get too much of an expansion in those molds. You might get too much of an explosion happening there. So you might not want that. You might want it more dense. You have to play around with that and kind of find your ideal solution to how to work that. Here, finish this off.
So if you were to weigh each of those loaves that you just formed, what is the raw dough weight, would you say, pre-bake?
The raw dough should be about 450 grams.
Okay.
Yep. All right. So this is a nice shot, kind of like from above. We see this every day, but as you can see, I'm going to put these all next to each other. just like that. So you can see all those waves. So at this point, we want to get some consistency, obviously, in the proofing, and obviously for our customers. So we're going to weigh each one. Each one has to be scaled because there are different aspects here. As I'm spreading the Nutella, Chris might be stealing some of mine, taking it over to his side. So we have a babka that might be a little heavier here or a little lighter on the other side. So we do have to get that consistency within every single babka. So every single babka has a range in terms of its weight. And that's just what we're going to do right now. I'm just going to scrape off the table here. All right, and I got these molds. So we're using these molds. Any molds could do. It's just that you have to find the right ratio in terms of the size of the pastry that you're going to put this in. And it takes a lot of trial and error. It takes a lot of experience to know. You never know right off the bat what type of mold will fit for the type of pastry that you're going to use. So from my experience, it did take many trials to get many different results in terms of the pastries that we make and in terms of the molds that we use. You could go freeform, but at the same time, I wouldn't suggest it just because you're going to lose a lot. When you go freeform with something like this right on a tray and bake it, you're going to dry it off a lot completely around it. And you're not going to get the same result as if you're using a mold. This retains a lot more moisture. It gets different textures on top. Where it is exposed, you get that crunchy layer, and then on the sides, you get a more caramelized, little softer texture. So, whatever works. But this for us works really well. So Chris is going to start scaling them, and obviously the range, and pass them on to me. And I'm just going to place them right into the mold.
Did you say that those molds were actually paper?
Yeah, these are paper.
And the buyer of this loaf gets it in the mold itself, or do you transfer it out?
Correct. No. The buyer gets it with the mold.
Baked in the mold. Okay.
Yes.
So it's paper mold, and somebody's asking if you would mind sharing your brands of cocoa and chocolate that you like to use.
For the cocoa and chocolate in general, or for the babka itself?
For the babka.
We use the cocoa and babka. Probably. I'm gonna get back to you on that because we have
chocolate chips. The types of chocolate, they're basically sounds like dark chocolate chips, not milk chocolate.
Yeah. It's really important when you go into this is to find something that you like in terms of the flavor, but also to make sure that it can retain its shape in the oven, in the bake. So it has to be bake stable. And what does that mean? It basically means that we have a lower percentage of cocoa butter in there in order for it not to melt and completely kind of blend into the dough. You don't want that. So bake stable with chocolate usually means more dry extract, less cocoa butter.
But obviously, as you're baking other products besides babkas, you probably use many different kinds of chocolate and cocoa powders throughout. Yeah,
exactly. So I tend to like, on the higher scale of the cocoa percentage, even though these days, it's very sad to hear that sometimes you can get, someone can tell you this is a 75% cocoa percentage. Most of it might be cocoa butter. There's no regulation all the time on these things, or the regulation could be very, very wide.
So you have to find a company who you really trust and gives you reliable information.
Exactly. It takes time, and it takes some relationships to build with different distributors and different purveyors and different quality chocolate makers. And obviously everything has a price, but it's worth it. When you actually find a really good chocolate that you like, you can't, obviously it is addictive. So, you don't want to skimp on the chocolate or any ingredient that you use for that matter. So our babkas are now beautifully laid and nestled into the molds. At this point, in terms of our processes, there are different aspects here, different calculations that we have to make in terms of if this is going to go right into our proofer and into the oven, or if this is going to go for an overnight fermentation. It's not always advisable at this point to ferment these overnight, unless you're going into a freezer, which would make much more sense. But in order for you to freeze these, you have to find a solution in terms of your yeast activity. Your pH levels have to be controlled. Yeast activity, I mean, when I say that, try to use an osmotolerant yeast, something to be able to withstand longer times in the freezer without breaking down.
And why don't we stop right on that osmotolerant? Most people who are watching probably are either professional bakers or serious bread bakers, enthusiasts. So they understand that there is a kind of yeast called osmotolerant. But just for the sake of the few that don't know what that is, can you just describe the difference between what we call regular dry yeast and osmotolerant?
Yeah. So osmotolerant is basically, as the name says, tolerant, or it's tolerant to the process, or it's more aggressive against the process of osmosis. What happens, there are many activities that are happening within the doughs that have higher amounts of sugar, and in the processes of ice crystals being formed in the freezer. So you want to make sure that this yeast strand is basically being able to combat and fight off the degradation of it. Does that make sense?
I think to me it does. To many people it probably does. I would say for the bottom line for those who again are not clear about it is osmotolerant yeast is designed specifically for doughs that are higher in sugar and possibly also higher in acid, because they won't be as affected by those two conditions, and they'll perform like the regular yeast. But if you use regular yeast there, it might be slower and more sluggish. Right.
And also what I would advise to that is if you're able and you want to freeze this at this point, and if you're using regular yeast, you want to make sure that this goes through the freezing process very, very quickly to delay any ice crystals. The size of the ice crystals here make a lot of sense, they can create a lot of troubles if you're going to freeze this at a very slow process. So another thing to keep in mind is get them into the freezer really fast and make sure your freezer is very, very cold. Okay, so at this point, for us, we have these proofing throughout the day, and obviously in the hundreds and in the thousands sometimes through the holidays. And we're going through racks upon racks upon racks of what we're seeing right here. So it's a huge part of our production, and we've kind of we're getting better at it, I think. At this point, we're going to proof this for approximately 2.5 to 3 hours at a controlled environment. Those of you who are going to try to make this at home, obviously, I'm assuming are very, very avid home bakers, might have a proof box or might have any conditions that make this much more stable in terms of the proofer, in terms of the humidity and the temperature, at around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, 85% relative humidity. This is the ideal conditions for this at 2.5 hours.
You're not too worried at 85 degrees about that butter melting or getting too soft.
Exactly. At those temperatures, our butter is stable. We're not at the melting range of those saturated fats or of the fats here, so we are good. And again, here comes to play a lot. The makeup of that butter. If you're using a low quality butter, you might have issues at that temperature.
But if you're proofing the bread at room temperature, say 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you probably have to add an hour or two to the proofing time, right?
Correct. And make sure that they are covered, of course, so that they don't develop any skin. That's going to affect them as well in terms of how they're going to proof.
Somebody was asking for clarification on the osmotolerant. Is that a fresh osmotolerant yeast or a powdered osmotolerant?
Powdered. It comes out as a dry. It looks.
That's the only kind I know.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with if there is an osmotolerant that's fresh out there.
I haven't seen it myself. So Anne, for that question, it's a powdered yeast. It's a dry yeast that looks just like regular instant yeast, but it'll say on there osmotolerant or designed for
correct
high sugar breads. Yeah.
Correct. And then also in terms of the dough makeup here, there's a lot to do with how the recipe is balanced. Any dough that has way too much yeast, for example, is never going to tolerate. It's never going to be an ideal kind of surrounding for it to get it into the freezer as quickly as possible. It's really important for us to use the right ingredients sometimes that are functional for those processes that we're using. Okay, so at this point, we're going to send them out into the proofer. Put these here for now.
Those doughs they're weighing just about a pound each, for those of us who think in terms of pounds and ounces. And about what will they sell for per loaf?
In terms of the price,
The price. What does it go out the door at?
what do we sell it at? $14.99, $12.99.
$12.99 retail. $12.99 retail. So that's a pretty good return on your investment, even though it does have some expensive ingredients in there for a 1 pound loaf. That's a rich bread, or almost a rich man's bread.
It's a rich man. It's a rich man's bread, but it can last you for a few days, and it's gonna satisfy the entire family. But you don't have to share. It could be.
Well, I don't know if it would last a few days in our home.
Yeah, usually in our home it doesn't last a few days. I kind of hide it from my wife, and when she comes home, she says, "Where's the babka?" I say, "Where's the babka?"
Yeah.
So we're gonna get this end result here. So as you can see, we kind of had these babkas on the tray, looking really, really sexy and beautiful. We lightly glaze them with a simple syrup, so a equal parts sugar to water.
Are these baked now? The ones in front of you are baked?
Excuse me?
Are those baked loaves in front of you?
Yes. Can you see?
I couldn't tell, but but it is baked. And at what temperature did you bake them?
Right. So we're gonna once those are ready to go into the oven, we're gonna use around 300 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 40 minutes. Wow. It's a low temperature because we're dealing with quite a loaf here.
Yeah.
We want to give it the proper amount of time. Now, even after that bake time, you're going to see that some parts of this babka are going to be more moist than others. That obviously, when you look at the edges here, for example, I don't know if you can see it on camera here, but if you look at the edges here, those are always going to be the crispiest parts. And also, depending on the placement of where they are on the tray, it's going to make a big difference sometimes in terms of their evenness, in terms of how they're baking. So, I'd say for those kind of purposes, when you're baking a lot, lower temperature for a longer time makes sense in this case. So as you can see, this is a really beautiful one. I don't know, I can show it to the camera right over there. But once they come out of the oven, we immediately glaze them with a simple syrup. Very light coating. What that does is basically engulfs and encases all that moisture in there and make sure that as in the cooling process, we're not losing too much moisture. It's not really to sweeten up anything because the simple syrup, the 1-to-1, is not that sweet when you think about it. Right. Especially on top of a dough like this that has so many different elements, we're not going to feel that sweetness from the simple syrup, and that's not the goal in terms of why we do that. So keep that in mind as well. Now, sometimes in our recipes we can go for flavored syrups that could be very interesting. You can, make different infusions that could be very, very interesting on top of different other products. So, something to take into account if you're making at home or if you're formulating your own babka recipe and you want to do different flavors, and not necessarily what we're showing here. Different flavored syrups can also be very interesting at the end to kind of glaze them. Okay, so we're gonna slice one open. All right. Unless we have other questions.
The big reveal. Well, I think we should get to the slicing and the looking, and then the tasting, and then we're going to switch over to the VIP lounge for those who have the VIP pass, so we can get more personal and intimate with you for a little bit, because we've very easily filled up this hour with pretty exciting demos. So thank you.
I'm sorry if I talked too much.
No, that was me. That's me throwing all those questions at you while you went. We covered everything while you went. It's great.
That's perfect. Okay, so here we go. Sarah, you got the camera ready? We got the camera ready.
All right.
So we're gonna slice it right down the middle, and we're gonna hope to see some nice babkas here.
Do you ever glaze these babkas with like fondant glazes, like cinnamon bun type glazes and things?
As a personal preference, I try not to. Although lately I've been very interested in some glazes that could be very, very opaque in terms of what they look like at the end. So very, very light.
Like brush,
mostly citrusy.
Look at those layers. Everything's expanded from what we saw being rolled up. It's like opened up into a whole new coil. Yeah.
It's really a thing of beauty. I mean, you can see really all these layers, and in terms of the lightness of these layers, like I see here, I don't want to get too close to the camera, but You can see all those that expansion, like you mentioned, Peter, as well as the Nutella and the chocolate chips that come into play. You can even see the chocolate chips as I sliced. You can see the texture of them.
Unbelievable. Well, Edan, this has
Yeah.
been fabulous. And Chris, thanks so much for being the Robin there to your Batman. And
Chris can't hear you, but I'm gonna tell them that you messed up so many times that they're not happy about the results.
yeah, no, don't tell them that. I'm just, again, as always, when we see something this beautiful, we want to jump through the screen and have it. I have had this because you were kind enough to send me a loaf a couple months ago, and I've been dying to see how you got to what I ate that day. And you know that when I come to New York City, for those people who are in the city, you've got more than one location where they can pick this up, right?
Yeah, so we have Union Square, which is our mothership, and 18 East 16th Street, and then we have our Lincoln Center location, 63rd and Broadway, and our Bryant Park location as well. So they're everywhere.
And you do mail order as well, correct?
Yeah, we ship nationwide through Goldbelly.
Goldbelly, all right.
You can also log on to our website at breadsbakery.com and get that shipped to you.
So lots of ways to get it. You will have the recipe. I've got Danielle has sent me a link to the recipe, and we'll post that for everybody in the archives section. And we're going to continue this conversation for those who can join us in the VIP lounge. And for those who can't, if you want to upgrade to VIP, just write to question@breadsymposium.com and ask them how to upgrade. But Chris, and if you're going to be able to join us, and Edan, if you could, we'll log out of this webinar. We'll log back in a couple of minutes. We'll take about a 3 to 5 minute break. And again, thank you for a fabulous demonstration. This will stay, on our website till the end of the year, and then next year we'll be putting them all up on YouTube. So this will go global, by this time next year. And
Sounds great. We're excited.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. See you again on Monday and Wednesday of next week and throughout the summer. And for many of you, we'll see you in 5 minutes in the VIP lounge. Edan Leshnick, Breads Bakery, thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Can you disconnect me or just end the call?
Yeah, end it.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you to our team behind the scenes. Our event technical and production partners, Ganoid Communications, including our producer, Gurmit Singh, and his team, Jita Gajaria, Gagandeep Singh, and Jaydev Kashari. Thanks also to Ted Nelson and Lael Fretzel of our creative and marketing team at Gumbo Marketing, and the many folks at Johnson & Wales University who supported me throughout this event. My executive assistant, Sarah Standifer, communications director, Melinda Law, Chancellor Mim Rooney, Charlotte Campus President, Cheryl Richards, and our executive team leaders, deans and faculty, Maureen Dumas, Michael Schrader, Michelle Nicholas, Mark Norman, Brent Steyerwalt, Laurie Heimbach, Jerry Lanuza, Amy Felder, Harry Paymiller, Richard Miskovich, and many, many others. Thank you all.